Hello everybody. This is Sean Dobson talking to you on a wet day in July 2018. We're making this video today because I'm concerned, as are many people, about the state of politics in the UK. It's over 2 years now since the people of the UK voted by a clear margin to leave the European Union. We did that referendum, or so we were told by Mr David Cameron, to avoid political controversy, so that whatever the opinions of individual MPs, government ministers, parties, the view of the British people would be binding. I thought that was a great exercise. I still do think it was the right thing to do. But we're being let down. It's regrettable I have to say this, but I'm fairly clear that there's been a contrived plan by very senior people in the current government, people in the media, elements of the business establishment, who are trying to systematically overturn the outcome of that referendum. Now, I appreciate a lot of people watching this video are more concerned about Scottish independence. I understand that and I respect that. But I think the message we've got to take from this situation is everybody who believes in democracy, everybody who wants self-government in their countries, whether you're talking about Britain or whether you're talking about Scotland, have got to sit up and take notice right now. Because a big section of the political elite is ignoring the vote of the people of this country. Now let's consider what happened in 2016. The referendum was called. In February of that year, David Cameron assured us that it was our decision. Yet between May and June of that year, we had this near hysterical campaign led by David Cameron and his Chancellor George Osborne, the BBC, much of the media, various interest groups who were almost hysterically stating that if we even had the temerity to vote to leave the European Union, it would be virtually the end of the world. Now, they were proven wrong. But the question I was asking myself at the time, and have asked myself ever since, is how can we have a situation where the people of this country are told they can have a democratic vote to decide their constitutional future, and then the same Prime Minister who calls that vote will then claim that if people vote any way other than what he or she wants, is unacceptable. By definition, that's not how a referendum is meant to work. But let's move forward a little bit. By a margin of 3.5–4%, there was a vote to leave the EU. Now, I can remember the morning after, I'd been up all night watching the coverage, and I was struck by a couple of things. Jeremy Corbyn, Labour Party leader, quite rightly said Article 50 should be triggered today, because regardless of what you may or may not think about his overall policies, Jeremy Corbyn believes in democracy. David Cameron, I think quite rightly, resigned. His behaviour during the referendum had been unacceptable and he really couldn't remain as Prime Minister of the country. But what concerns me is what happened within the Conservative Party thereafter. The Conservatives choose to elect Theresa May their leader, somebody who believes in staying in the European Union. Now, Theresa May have gone to great lengths to assert her belief in the view of the British people that they should leave the EU. But let's look at the evidence. What was her first act as Prime Minister? She appoints her Chancellor. Who does she appoint? Philip Hammond. What's Philip Hammond's view in the European Union? He avidly believes we should stay. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, as far as I can see, he used all his power to keep us within the EU, or at least under its control. So I'm left thinking to myself, there's a travesty of democracy going on here. We have a Prime Minister who asserts her belief in Britain leaving the EU, but in practice has shown no interest in really achieving it. Now let's think about something else. What is the point about leaving the European Union? It's not meant to be a highly complicated exercise. It's not meant to be about being confrontational with our European neighbours. It's not meant to be about nationalism. It's not meant to be about being against immigration. It's meant to be about democracy and the right of the people of this country to elect a parliament and by extension a government that makes the laws by which we are governed. That is simple democracy. The big dispute in politics today, I think, is this. We are in a situation where a majority of British politicians don't seem to believe that their job collectively as the Parliament of this country is to make the laws by which we are governed. Rather, they take the view, quite simply, that their job is to legally authorise the transfer of the governance of our country to the European Union, which essentially is an unelected bureaucracy. I find that situation quite intolerable. I've felt that way all my adult life. And I believe we need to leave the European Union. We need to become an independent state. Going back to Theresa May, all she had to do when she became Prime Minister, indeed all that David Cameron needed to do before he left office, was to present a bill to Parliament to amend the European Communities Act with a very simple stipulation that henceforth British law would hold supremacy over European Union directives. So it wouldn't be a case of having to go through the possible disruption of reversing every single European Union policy that's been enacted in this country, but it would have set the simple legal principle that the British Parliament is sovereign and its job is to make the laws by which we are governed. It is not its job to transfer its authority to the European Union. That hasn't been done. Instead, we find a situation where over 2 years have gone since we had the vote. There's unopen question marks whether we'll either leave the European Union, or if we do, it's being suggested that we'll have to accept its directives on large areas of public policy. We'll be struggling to actually take back our independence in terms of, for example, making our trade relations. I really find that very, very wrong. Some people, I think, look on this as a conservative project. People watching this of a perhaps more liberal or progressive outlook may feel that Brexit has nothing to do with them. Well, let me tell you a story. About 25 years ago, I was watching a documentary about the role of Parliament in the British political system, and I was struck by the words of Tony Benn, who's now dead. Tony Benn was a democratic socialist, a great political intellectual, a believer in democracy. And the following words struck me. He said, "Sovereignty is the right to make the laws by which you are governed." So sovereignty is not claiming that the government of a country can control the weather or control all outcomes, but it does mean that the laws by which you live are made by the Parliament that you elect. I would challenge anybody watching this video, anyone anywhere, to explain to me why we shouldn't have a national Parliament that has the authority to make the laws by which we live. But for some reason, we're in a situation where much of our political establishment doesn't want Britain to become an independent democracy. I think this is terribly wrong. Let's take another look at another issue here. Many years ago, we had a Prime Minister called John Major. Now, John Major came into power in rather questionable circumstances at the end of 1990, and his main policy was to put Britain at the heart of Europe. And what did he do? He insisted that we keep our national currency, the pound, locked into the exchange rate mechanism at far too higher rate. Interest rates were far too high, and Britain had the worst recession it experienced since the end of the 1920s. Millions of people lost their jobs, thousands of businesses went into receivership, millions of people lost their homes. It was only when the currency markets broke that policy that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Lamont, was then able to bring interest rates down, and strangely enough, within a matter of months, economic recovery began. Now, all the political establishment, whereas John Major as Prime Minister, Michael Heseltine, Kenneth Clarke, Douglas Hurd, the Labour leader, the late John Smith, Gordon Brown, the Shadow Chancellor, most of the policy establishment, most of the big business establishment, all believed in being an exchange rate mechanism. Most of them believed that Britain should take part in a single European currency. And it's only because people who were perceived as unreasonable at the time, like the UK Independence Party, like certain right-wing conservatives, certain Labour socialists who said no, a nation retains its currency, it's the core of its independence, its right to function as a democracy. Now we've seen in countries like Ireland, Spain, Italy, to name but a few, who have suffered grievously in the Eurozone. You have countries like Spain that have about 50% of young people out of a job. I'm so glad that we never joined the single European currency, and I pray we never do. But what really troubles me is I look back to the whole history of being in the ERM, all the unemployment that caused, all the difficulties it caused, the way in which John Major's government would not rule out joining the euro, the way that Tony Blair's Prime Minister and New Labour tried to get us into the single currency, and not one of these people has ever apologised. I find it disgusting to live in a situation where something like that can happen, and these people our respectable politicians, as they would like to see themselves, could try to do that to us. So, I have to be quite frank here. Everybody who believes in democracy, whether you believe in democratic socialism, whether you believe in free enterprise liberal capitalism, has got to stand together. This is our chance to take back our democracy for Britain, so that future generations can live in an independent state, where members of Parliament make the laws by which they live, where government ministers are accountable to Parliament and not to an unelected assembly or committee in Brussels. It really is as simple as that. I believe in this all my adult life, and I continue to do so. I stood for election last year on this platform, and I got a not unrespectable 402 votes. I may do so again. I hope and I pray that the people of this country can prevail and we get our independence back. This is a historic time for Britain. It's a historic time for Scotland. So I say, let's stick together. Let's take back our independence. Thank you very much.